In this episode, I want to discuss mental health issues that I've seen around me. We just spent 3 weeks back in the United States, and I had many meetings with friends, past clients, and professional colleagues. I heard from many of them speak about the mental health issues they or their families were experiencing in the post-pandemic world. I wrote about this in my last Career Pivot Insights newsletter, and I received more responses than I've ever received. It obviously resonated with a lot of people. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 323 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I want to discuss mental health issues that I've seen around me. We just spent 3 weeks back in the United States, and I had many meetings with friends, past clients, and professional colleagues. I heard from many of them speak about the mental health issues they or their families were experiencing in the post-pandemic world. I wrote about this in my last Career Pivot Insights newsletter, and I received more responses than I've ever received. It obviously resonated with a lot of people. This episode is sponsored by the Career Pivot community, but I'm not going to run any ads in this. I want to keep this episode short, as I think this is an important topic. So I started out meeting with a good friend, past client, who has been unemployed for a year by choice. He is burned out. He worked really hard during the pandemic. He was part of a technology company. And the one thing he has done right is take time off. When you are burned out, you need to take a break. Financially, he's okay, but he's in his 40s. He needs to go back to work at some point in time. He was kind of lost. Well, I've experienced this myself. I have twice run into the situation where I was totally burned out. And both after I left, I took a break from my tech career and went off and taught high school math for a year and a half, 2 years. And I left where I was really depressed. I was exhausted. And what I needed to do was probably take a good whole year off and re-energize. I did not. I took about 6 months off. Actually, I tried to go back to work immediately, taking some contract work, which was a big mistake. I needed to take time off. When I left my last tech startup, I was totally burned out. And I took a good 6 months to a year off. And that helped me recover. The second person I had coffee with was, again, a good friend and a former client. And he has had health issues. He retired. And it's real interesting. We got talking about his wife. His wife is still working. She works for a major financial institution. And she's been dealing with insurance of all kinds for private individuals and small businesses. And rather interesting, she loved her job for the longest time. Now she is spending almost all her time explaining why insurance rates have gone up so much, specifically related to climate change. And basically, she's dealing with a lot of unhappy people. And I will tell you, dealing with unhappy people is not a fun thing. And now she's questioning why she keeps doing what she's doing. And she's got some plans to doing something completely different. It's worrying about the finances and whether she can actually go do this. This really resonated with me because back in IBM in the early 90s, I was building training programs for support people at IBM. And I remember talking to one of the support managers and telling him we could help him with his staff's morale problems. And he looked at me and says, "How do you know we have morale problems?" And I said, "Your people are on the phones every day with people who have problems. Nobody that these folks are talking to are happy. They want their system fixed." He finally admitted, yes, he had morale problems. So it's interesting seeing how my former client's spouse was now questioning because it's dealing with problem people. I've heard about this before. One time when we were driving back during the pandemic, we stopped in our favorite place in Matehuala when we were driving back to our home in Mexico. And a couple spotted us that we had at the time. We had a car with Texas license plates, and they asking us, where we were living, and we got in discussion. And they owned a restaurant in New Braunfels, Texas, which is just north of San Antonio. And they were having horrible problems keeping staff. Their son now ran the restaurant, and he couldn't keep staff because the bad behavior of the customers. And this is one of the things we're seeing over and over again is people just not willing to put up with the crap that people give them. The third thing I wanted to talk about, I met with an old friend who I've had as a colleague for 15 years. His business blew up during the pandemic. He's in the meetings business. That completely died. And he pivoted during the pandemic. And he finally has taken a job at an association. And one of the things he discussed with me was the fact that he had some depression issues. It took prodding from friends and family to go seek help. He just wasn't quite willing to do that on his own. He needed to be prodded. Well, I will tell you, depression runs big time in my family. And I have dealt with it on and off for probably 30 to 40 years. Now, I've gotten pretty good at spotting it and learning how the triggers work and then what I can do. One of the things my therapist taught me years ago was to spot the physical manifestations of depression. For me, I can feel it behind my eyes. And I know whenever I get that feeling, I need to get on my bike regularly and vigorously exercise. So it's one of those things is I know how to spot it early. I also maintain a diet that seems to work for me, and I'm very rigorous about maintaining my diet. The last person I had a discussion with is, again, a former client who works for a state agency in Texas. And one of the things she discussed was, prior to the pandemic, her commute was tolerable. It was long, but it was tolerable. Then the pandemic hit and she worked from home and her entire staff worked from home. Recently, her management said, everyone back in the office. Why? Well, we feel it will be better. Notice that we feel it will be better. And that's one of the things I'm hearing over and over again. What she told me was, well, now she's back commuting, not every day, but what was a tolerable commute before is now intolerable now because she saw the fact that she really didn't need to do this. It was an hour commute each way in crappy traffic. And why am I doing this? In this case, she took a job at a state agency so she can get a pension, and she needs to hang on 5 or 6 more years. By the way, she's putting up with it. She don't like it, but she's putting up with it. And we'll see how long that lasts. And the last thing I wanted to talk was I had an interesting phone call a couple of weeks ago, and I say it's interesting because interesting is an interesting word. I had a podcasting buddy send me an email that he was contacted by a listener who was interested in relocating to Mexico. And it's one of these deals. I said, sure, I'll talk to her. And then via email, he made an introduction and we set up a time for a phone call. I started talking to this person and I realized this person had some pretty big misconceptions about what life would be like in Mexico. And she already had a residency, which is kind of made me think, wow. We got in discussion around inflation and it was obvious she did not understand what was going on in Mexico. Then she asked me about my political persuasions, which I balked. I don't like to talk about politics. And by the way, I'm a pretty middle of the road politically. I'm not on the fringes one end or the other. That's when things went bad. When she heard who I voted for in the last election, which was a big mistake, I should have kept my mouth shut. This person started to rant about how the liberals were ruining their life and they should all have a bullet shot through their heads. And that's when she hung up. I went, whoa. I politely sent this person an email saying, sorry, but moving to Mexico is not going to solve her problems, and wished her luck and said goodbye. She then sent me an email with 3 videos from really dubious sources with lots of misinformation. And I only had to look at it real quickly and go, wow. Whoo. This person had gone down a rat hole of conspiracy theories, which we all know is not good for anyone's mental health. Now, I tend to, all through all the therapy I've had, I self-observe. One of the things I noticed was I didn't react to someone saying I should have a bullet put in my head. Similarly, recently I've had 2 occasions where I had to deal with Mexican immigration authorities, and I was able to stay cool, calm, and collected when they spoke to me in Spanish. And by the way, I struggle with my oral comprehension, and I mostly understood them and was able to respond appropriately. In fact, we were approaching the soft border. We were driving north on May 2nd. You hit what we call the soft border, which is 20 miles from the actual physical border. And there's a checkpoint, and the member of La Guardia Nacional, the National Guard, flagged me over, sent me over to a place where they were searching cars. I rolled down my window and he started asking me where I was coming from and where I was going. And then he looked in the back of my car and he saw I had my bicycle because I was going to ride my bicycle in Austin, Texas, where we were going. And he started asking me questions about it. And I knew what he was doing. I won't get into that, but he wanted to make sure it was legit. It wasn't a stolen bicycle because it's a bike worth a couple $1,000s. And I stayed cool, calm, collected, and I really was impressed with the fact that I understood him and I could respond to him appropriately. And then he said, "Calla vaya bien." I can go in Spanish. And I went, yes. Previously I have been stopped by police, and one time I was stopped by a police officer for making a wrong turn. He technically could not legally stop me, but he did. And then he checked my paperwork, and I didn't have all the paperwork in the car. And then he said he was going to confiscate the car. And I told him, no, he's not. And my wife is freaking out, and I'm staying totally calm. And I called my lawyer. My lawyer spoke with him. And my lawyer basically told him, says, pay him a bribe. Pay him a mordida. And which I did. And when it was all said and done and I left, I found I wasn't beating myself up. I even emailed my therapist back in Austin, said, you'd be proud of me. It didn't trigger any bad behaviors. It didn't trigger any bad thoughts. So one of the things I find is monitoring my own behavior. Does any of this sound familiar? If it does, I want to encourage you to seek help. As I said, I've experienced a lot of mental health issues in my life, and it took me some real prodding to get help. And I've sought help multiple times in my life, and I've always glad I did. The pandemic has been hard on all of us. If you need it, go get help. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com, sign up for the Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which comes out every Sunday. You will get your weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. When you subscribe, you will receive my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Look for Career Pivot on LinkedIn. And thank you for listening all the way to the end of this very important Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-333. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Podbeam, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.